Thank you very much, Mika, for the nice and encouraging words. So we are quite enthusiastic to continue in the same way. Speaking about continuation, we are going straight to the first presentation, which is entitled Immersive Digital Reality by Professor Markus Magnor, the head of the Computer Graphics Lab of the Computer Science Department at TU Braunschweig, Germany. He has BA and MS degrees in physics from Würzburg University and the University of New Mexico, and a PhD in electrical engineering from Erlangen. And he has held a postdoc position at the Computer Graphics Lab at Stanford. And actually, I've known Markus from one big European project called 3D TV, when 3D TV was a big thing. Now we have VR, which is pretty much the same about delivering the 3D visual experience to humans. And he is also having one of these highly prestigious ERC grants. With research interests in visual computing, visual information processing, image formation, acquisition analysis, and image synthesis, display, perception, and cognition. So I think that he is the best person to give the first talk in today's event. Please, you're welcome.
Atanas, thank you very much for your very nice and warm words. I'm honored to be here today. Atanas invited me, I think it was shortly before Christmas, and it took me just a moment to decide that I cannot miss out on the opportunity to come here today. And you know, these are very important days for our field. Those of you who registered in time, you were able to come to Tampere. Everyone else who didn't make it in time had to travel all the way to Las Vegas to some consumer electronics show there. And I read about it on the airplane yesterday. So I think Google announced a standalone VR headset, and Facebook, Oculus did the same, which are good news because these big companies are still believing in the technology and in the applications and in the business model. So the not so good news that I read in the paper was that in the US they expect revenue in this area to be about $1.2 billion this year, which sounds like a lot of money, but for the analysts that was kind of disappointing. They had expected to make more money in VR. And if we remember back the hype like 3 or 4 years ago in this field when Oculus started with the Rift, it felt like this was going to be the next big thing, and we're all still waiting for it to be the next big thing, I pretend to say. So let me start looking at where we are and where we want to go and what needs to be done from a research point of view. I'm from a university, so we don't have much money to build fancy hardware. We have to live with what we can build ourselves or what we can buy for little money. But on the other side, we can concentrate on the research part and don't have to produce working prototypes that we have to sell. So that's the good thing. Let me start looking at this thing from where television sets are right now. I'm sure you know that we are now with Ultra HD resolution at 4K. You can buy television sets at that resolution now. They are 1.50 meters, 2 meters diagonal. So if you have a standard living room, that is already almost immersive because it's going to fill up your entire window. You have OLED technology, you have LCD, LED technology being perfected. So you have very brilliant colors, you have great contrast, you have high dynamic range technology, so you can display dynamic range 10,000 to 1. All these things seem to be almost solved, I would say. So the images that you can watch on a big television set are almost as if you were really there. The thing that this community did about 10, 12 years ago was they introduced stereo, mainly, of course, from the movie industry and the movie theaters, which was their way of forcing the movie theaters to go digital. So Hollywood would know which movies were shown how many times, because they would be able to track that instead of just giving out the copies and not really knowing how often it was run. But anyways, so what we gained from that was stereo. We all wore these funny glasses and enjoyed seeing the world in 3D. Again, it had been around about 40, 50 years ago already. Of course, now it's all perfected and technologically much better, but essentially it was the same thing. And the movie directors first loved it, and then they hated it, and now there are some movies coming out in 3D, and most are coming out in 2D again, and some are coming out in both, and so not really clear where that is going. It used to be a big thing as well at that time. Okay, and then from that point on, we got immersion. We got our head-mounted displays, which you could build yourself using this cardboard that Google put on the web, and just use your smartphone, or you could spend a little bit of money and get something better. And this was a huge thing and success in a way that suddenly the general audience would know about VR and head-mounted displays. Now, for people who have been in that business for 20 years, that was nothing new. VR headsets have been around since the 1980s, I believe, but they were expensive. They were only confined to the lab. Now you could actually use this at home. If you look at just the characteristics that I put up there, I didn't put a mark for frame rate, latency, and so on for these headsets yet, because, as you know, there are still some issues with that. It's not as perfect as if you had a big TV set at home, and that would be the standard. That's where you want to go. So the question is, what do you need to do to get there? And I will address that and give you a couple of ideas that might resonate with you, and you might get something out of it. There's one more thing I have to add to this, which is motion parallax. If you're able to track the head position, you're able to have ego motion parallax, that is, move around the object. And that's actually very important, I think. If you look at what's out there in the marketplace, and if you look at the VR goggles that don't have motion tracking, it's getting strenuous in like 10 minutes or so. You really want to be able to see what is happening to the scene when you move your head around. That is what makes it interesting. So that is something that I think needs to be added, not only from the motion tracking side, but also from the image creation side, which is very simple for 3D scenes. If you have computer graphics there, you can create any viewpoint in a snap. But if you wanted to do that with a real scene that you have recorded with a video camera, it's not that easy. So that is something that I think also needs to be worked on. Now, in the next 40 minutes or so, I would like to present to you 3 different gadgets that you could add on, or ideas that you could add to standard head-mounted displays, and see how you could improve on these points that are still have these wavy lines there, and at the same time maybe get something more out of it. And the first idea that I would like to present is something that I'm sure will be presented in more detail and in a more perfect manner by the next speaker, by the company Voyeurs. We had essentially, obviously, the same idea a couple of years ago, just to add eye tracking to your head-mounted display. And if you know where the user is looking, you can use that information to improve on latency of the rendering. You can improve on the perceptual issues, and you can also add depth of focus, as well as eye contact if you have several users in your VR space. The prototype that we built looks like this. We just used a 3D printer and a standard in the visible and reflective in the infrared, which is a standard technique. Use some infrared LEDs here and some infrared cameras to record the pupils. And that way we were able to record where the person was looking, having calibrated everything. The entire set, of course, consists of some more parts. So the PhD student had some time to work on this, to create a working prototype, get his lenses right and the calibration, all these things. But in the end, what we got was something like this. You see one of the eyes being tracked here on the right-hand side, and then the prototype with the glowing, actually this is infrared light, the glowing illumination for the eyes. And with that, we got a system that worked with a very low latency on the PC, about 12.5 milliseconds. If you used the Raspberry Pi, it was about 3 times that time, but you can always improve on the timing. And the resolution, the angular resolution accuracy was about 1 to 2, maybe 3 degrees, which is not perfect, but which is sufficient for a couple of things that we wanted to do. And the first thing that you can do now, which is very simple, is you can now use the information where your user is looking to mimic depth of focus. You just render the scene in focus where the person is looking, and the rest of the scene, the front and the back, you just use some clever algorithm and render that unsharp, which gives you a more naturalistic feeling of what is really out there, because now you have at least the impression on the retina that the scene is out of focus where you're not focusing. It's not exactly the same thing as in nature, because when you look at something, your lens is adjusting its focal length, which is not the case with a head-mounted display. But for the brain, this I claim looks already pretty convincing. Okay, the next easy thing to do is then just to use that information and render your avatar with the eyes blinking and looking at a certain point. I know that Facebook is, I'm sorry for the avatar. Looks kind of strange. Just look at the eyes, okay? I know that Facebook is researching this topic at their lab in Zurich. Their idea is to use head-mounted displays for social VR. So instead of Skyping with someone, you would just use your head-mounted display, and you would see the other person's avatar and just talk to him as if he were or she were there. But if you can't look someone in the eye, that's very annoying. And if you can't read the facial expression, that's also very annoying. So the next thing that would have to be added now is to kind of get the mimics of the face, even though you're wearing these goggles. And I'm sure they're working on this as well. There are papers on it already. But looking at someone is one of the key things that you want to include if you have several people working collaboratively in VR. Okay, the next thing takes a bit of preparation here, which is that the resolution of the HMD is more or less uniform over your angular space. I mean, yes, you have distortion because of the lenses and everything, but because you have a regular grid of pixels there, let's say it's just a uniform display resolution. And we all know that your fovea resolution is still much better than what the display can provide. Yes, say you have a 2,000 pixel display, you cut that in half for each eye, and you now spread those 1,000 pixels over, say, 100 or 120 degrees, then you have something like, say, 8 or 10 pixels per degree, and that's not enough really for the acuity here. But that's only where you're looking. That's where you're focusing, where you look when you're concentrating on something. Your entire peripheral vision has much lower resolution, or not much lower, but considerably lower. And so there's resolution wasted, obviously, and actually it's quite a bit. It's about 90, 98, 95% of resolution that's not being perceived at the rendered resolution because it's in the fovea, in the periphery, I'm sorry. So even though you cannot do anything about the display, you might be able to exploit this fact to increase rendering times, to just render quicker, because you could get away with lower resolution out here. So for that to work, you have to know where you're looking. Well, that is something the eye tracking gives you. But then in the periphery, it's not that simple. You cannot just blur everything to the side or anything, because if there's something blinking or if there's something bright, you will still perceive it, and you will also perceive that it's something important. You might be saccading to that point next moment. So you want to be adjusting your resolution, your rendering resolution, to what's in that scene. And it's even more complex than that, because there's not just one thing that's blinking or a bright highlight, but there are many different things. So you might end up with something that looks like this. The first thing of all is, of course, you have to come up with some idea of what is the correct resolution that you want to use for different regions of the scene to render. And my PhD student came up with this, and I'm not going to explain this to you. If you're interested in it, please read his paper. He's been looking at lots of psychological papers and went through the studies that they did on what we perceive and what is not being perceived and masked, and then came up with this algorithmic model where he's taking into account the material, specularity, edges, movement, all these things. And then he developed a rendering algorithm that is making use of this information using something that is called deferred shading. And instead of just rendering this scene one triangle after the other, it's actually more like a stochastic process. He's rendering some regions, he's sampling at a higher resolution than others, and the rest is then just being filled up. For that to make sense, this GPU rendering time, so this is the rendering time or the display time for a single frame. You want to concentrate on the GPU time, which consists of 3 different parts. The shading is the part that is the most expensive one if you're rendering with complex algorithms that are supposed to make the scene look realistic. So you want to save time here by doing this foveal peripheral rendering. And so this is then being actually, yes, reduced. And you do need to do some gaze contingent sampling beforehand and the image interpolation of the holes after that. But in total, this time here is less than that. So you end up with a better frame rate, higher frame rate. And just to show you what this looks like, here's a scene that he rendered. If you're looking at this red cross here, so this would be the ground truth rendered in full resolution. And if you had just noticed, this was now switching over to the per pixel shaded reference, to the adaptive reference. And if you're now at the right distance, and if you were looking at this, for example, in a head-mounted display, you could actually see no difference, almost no difference. At the moment where it's changing, yes, you do see that there's something changing, but you could not say that one has a higher quality than the other. And that's the important thing. And you're rendering at a higher frame rate. And what you see here is the output of the psychological model. What is important, what should be sampled at a higher rate, and where can you get away with less samples. Okay, let me go on and talk about another approach that you could do, which is use gaze guidance, or know in advance where the user will be looking. If you do eye tracking, you know in real time where the user is looking, and then you can try to react to that, but you only have something like, say, 30 milliseconds to do that, which doesn't give you all the opportunity that you might like to have. If you had more time, could do more algorithmic magic, would be better. So instead of doing eye tracking, you could say, let's create a scene where we already know where the user will be looking. And if you don't do anything about it, these are just eye tracking examples for one panorama scene here for, I think, 5 different users. And you see that sometimes they look to the same spot, but then they diverge and look into other directions. So you could not really create one version of this video offline that would suit everyone. Or the other way around, they would probably notice that something is not right because they're not looking at the right spot at the right time. So ideally, you would like to have everybody looking at the same point in the scene at the same time. Now, if you're a movie director, essentially you've solved that problem, or you've learned how to do that, because when we watch a movie made in Hollywood right now, we all more or less look at the same scene areas at the same time, because we're being directed to that direction. Now, it's not as clear how to do that in 360, but there is a technique out there called subtle gaze direction. It was presented 8 or 9 years ago at SIGGRAPH, where people showed that if you were showing this kind of stimulus here in the periphery, you would saccade to it with pretty consistent results. And if you turn this off at the time where you've saccaded, let's say you have an eye tracking device again, you would not be consciously aware of it. So you would saccade to that point, but you wouldn't know why, because you wouldn't see this anymore. And this is kind of the trick behind it. And what they proposed was to use a Gaussian blob that was flickering at about 10 hertz. Now, how do you, and that was at that time done on a display, just an ordinary monitor. If you were to do that in a head-mounted display, the question is, of course, what size does this blob have to be? And you could also play with the other parameters. We just looked at the size and just did a user study where we placed this blinking at 5-degree intervals, and then and then asked people to look at the small circle here in the middle and just give notice when they recognized it. And what comes out is about this curve here. So the farther away you are from the foveal region, the bigger this blob should be for it to be recognized. Well, okay, that's good to know, and especially what is good to know is the slope of this line, because you don't want to have it too big and not too small either. Second thing is, if you have now a more complicated scene and you were now doing the same thing, how does that affect the results? How much bigger would this blob have to be? Because now the scene is more complicated. You have this masking effect maybe, and turns out, well, you also have more or less a linear dependency here, and if you show both in the same diagram, you see it's a little bit higher, but you could still see some relation there. So you could use now this information if you were to create a gaze directing algorithm for head-mounted displays. Last thing we did was then see how that helps if you are given the task of finding a certain object in a cluttered scene. And say you were given this image and you were told, well, not an image, it's like a panorama. You're in 360. And you were asked to find the sphere, which is, for example, hidden almost. And people are looking around trying to find it. And then the second run, you show this subtle blinking in that direction, and see how much longer or how much time do people need now to find this place. And we find here the blue trials are the ones without the flickering, and the orange ones are including this gaze directing technique. And we see that the numbers go down, the time to find the object goes down, especially if you have complicated or difficult examples, as for example the sphere that is almost occluded by some other object. So what you see here is the saccade, or the search movement of the eye over time to find the object, the angular distance. And you see that it's going down, and it's much quicker here, especially for difficult cases. So you can use it for that as well. Which might be also helpful if you were to direct the user to look at something that is not out of his field of view. Let's say the action is behind him, but he doesn't know it because he's looking there. How is he supposed to know? Well, of course, you can do this with acoustics maybe, and alternatively, maybe you can use some gaze directing technique to kind of let him walk his gaze over to the other side. So let's say you know where your user is looking. That helps you to prepare this scene and prepare the footage that you're presenting. And one thing that is important is if you have a fast-moving scene, something that is moving quickly and that is being rendered or displayed at a finite frame rate, of course, that you can get aliasing, and that this aliasing gets kind of annoying. Say, for example, you have this biker here, and he's flying through the air pretty quickly. The camera is following, so that everyone is, of course, focusing here on the bike, but the camera is not moving exactly on spot. So you have to have a very short exposure time, which gives you very sharp images in the back and the front, perfect. But if now the frame rate is, say, only 60 hertz, the background will be jumping many pixels from one frame to the next, and you will see that in a moment. If you use a longer exposure time, things will get blurry. Ideally, you would like to have the foreground object in focus and sharp, and the background blurred according to the motion blur that's stemming from the finite exposure time and the finite frame rate. Just to walk you through this, say you have something that is moving in the scene from here to there, which in this case here would be the background. And you have something else that is moving upward, and your eye is following this object that is moving upward. This is known as smooth pursuit eye movement. Typically, we can only jump from one point to the other. Yeah? If you try to move your eye continually along a row, that doesn't really work. You always jump. That's what the psychologists tell me. The only way of having a smooth motion of the eye is if you're following something that's moving through your field of view. And so this is called smooth pursuit eye movement, and that is what's happening right here. And so in nature, what would be visible on your retina for the background that you're not tracking, say something like this. So this is this linear motion and that linear motion superimposed. Okay? This would be the real thing. This is ground truth. If you're recording the scene now with the camera, say with the 2 frames, what would happen is you have an exposure time, and the background, and the camera is moving now, not the eye, now the camera is moving that way. You would have blur, motion blur, and then you would have motion blur there, but you would have this jump. And this doesn't look natural. And if you were to, if you now include the fact that a camera also has a dead time, just to read out the frame, you would get this hole in the exposure time. So now in addition, you even also get ghosting artifacts in there. You could now go ahead and increase the frame rate of your camera. Say you just spend more money on a high-speed camera and have 4 frames. It will alleviate the problem, but it will not solve it. You will still have these blocks here instead of having a straight line. And the idea now is to create something that on your retina looks like this by doing something with the images beforehand, before you show them on the display. And these are already the results. This is a static camera looking straight ahead. And there's a bicyclist riding by pretty quickly. If you have very short exposure times, then a single frame of the camera looks like this. Camera is, the bicycle is sharp, the background of course is sharp, and that's fine. But if you now have one frame and the next, this bicycle will be jumping from one to the next, ghosting, because the frame rate of the camera is not as high as what you would like to have to see it in smooth motion. Same for the display. If you now have long exposure, what would happen is that the bike will get blurred, of course, because that's the moving part. The camera is static, the background remains static. However, because you're following the interesting thing in the scene, you're following the bike, you see it blurred. You want to see the bicycle in sharp focus, but instead you want to see the background blurred appropriately. So this is what you want to do. And if you don't like bicyclists, you can also take skateboarders. Okay. Other thing is if the camera is moving around the object. So if you have short exposure, look at the background. You might see that it's kind of a ghosting artifact there. And then if you have a long exposure, you see, if you look closely on the object, that it's more blurred. With the perceptual filter, you can keep the foreground in focus and sharp, and the background is blurred accordingly. And here we have the motocross biker again, which is the original sequence. Look at the background, how that seems to be jumping. If a long exposure, the bike is not sharp. And if you now do the right filtering, it looks better. Okay, so that is another thing that you can do beforehand, but it takes longer time. So you cannot do this right away with the eye tracking, because you have to analyze the scene somewhat. And it's all automatic, but it takes more than 30 milliseconds to do this. Another thing that you can do when you know where this smooth pursuit eye movement is happening is you can artificially, or perceptually I should say, perceptually increase the resolution of your screen at the expense of what you need for that is a high frame rate. Let's say that you have a display that has a pixel size that is still considerably larger than the angular extent of one receptor in your fovea, which for the time being is still a valid assumption. Otherwise, it doesn't make sense. If your resolution is already at foveal limits, we don't need this anymore, but let's say we're not there yet. At least with HMDs, we're not. And let's say you have a high frame rate, 120 hertz or better. With HMD, we're not at 120 hertz yet, but I would assume that we are getting there if there's use for it, and I say there is. So this 120 hertz is much higher than our flicker frequency, at least in the foveal region. And now the idea is, or now what we need is the smooth pursuit eye movement. I just explained that. Your eye is following some foreground smoothly. So the foreground object is fixated on the fovea. Our ocular system is very efficient at that. And so if you now look at a single receptor in your fovea, the color and brightness that it perceives is determined by a certain integration time. Even our eyes are not perfect singular entities, but they also need to integrate over time to get a signal. And depending on light level, this integration time can be up to 100 milliseconds. So this is the minimum flicker frequency of 10 hertz. Maybe a little bit less, but let's just say 100 milliseconds here. And now there is this paper by Didic et al. 8 years ago, very good paper. And they had the idea, ingenious idea, of exploiting this smooth pursuit eye movement and the high display frame rate to show a sequence of frames on the screen such that for the moving eye, a single receptor over its integration time can get a better, or can get distinct information on the scene that is then essentially giving a better resolution. And because I cannot explain this just in words, let me show you a small video here. So this is the work by Didic. They have something that is moving, and that is important, diagonally. And if it's moving diagonally and our eyes are following it, smooth pursuit eye movement, some point within this hay bale here, then for two different receptors in our fovea, the green and the blue one, over the integration time, they will see these integrated colors here, depending on what they covered there. And by just now steering these pixel colors quickly, they can now per cone more or less get a better resolution. The thing is, the scene has to move diagonally, and the entire scene. So here for the background, you would not get any effect. And if something was moving just in vertical direction, you would not have a resolution enhancement in horizontal direction. And now there you could do something with if it's moving diagonally back and forth, but if you have motion like this, it's getting difficult again because you don't know where people are looking. Okay, so the underlying idea is great, just that it cannot be directly applied to arbitrary video. Now you need this diagonal direction so that you can address every cone individually. Otherwise, you only have the horizontal or the vertical direction. And so the idea is now, of course, just add motion in the right direction so that it's not, so that it's enabling this effect of apparent resolution enhancement, but without interfering with the story or the scene. So ideally, you don't even see that something is moving. And for that, that's essentially an optimization problem for a given scene. So here, nothing is moving. And if you were now just moving it back and forth within that frame, well, you clearly see that there are these kinks where the motion stops and goes in the other direction. So you're defining an optimization function there, and then also taking saliency into account, you come up with an optimal motion path that you can then still edit so that you get best possible results. I cannot show you the true results because I can't show you 120 hertz frames on my laptop and this projector here. But there's code that you can download, and if you have a 120 hertz display, you can try this out. Just to show you that the motion is really almost imperceptible, you don't see much difference between these two, I believe. And for these two sequences, the same thing, or here. Now, the important thing is you don't see the difference between the motion that the director added and the motion that is now being added by the algorithm. Okay, let me come to the third big thing, and I mentioned this already in the beginning, which is how to import the real world into head-mounted displays. So far, most of this was, if you wanted to react to something, was computer-generated. But I think the big thing in visual entertainment is if you can watch a real-world scene, either on your TV or, next step, immersively with your VR goggles. For that, you need to record the scene, of course, and not just model it with Maya or Studio Max or something like that. And I'm sure some of you at least have tinkered with this, and if you use these toys that you can buy for, I don't know, $100 as cameras, you get lousy resolution. If you really want to enjoy a recorded scene, you need professional grade resolution, and we can talk about what that means. And you need a high frame rate, and the dynamic range must be decent. You see how this is much brighter there than here, and the shadows, and so on. And if you want to do that, you're facing all these challenges. You need probably more than one camera or one CMOS or CCD chip, and they should be synchronized if you have more than them. And if you use more than one, they will have different color responses, so you need to grade them, and you need to stitch them together to get a panorama. Then these cameras will not have the same center of projection. So you cannot just take these images as are and then just combine them. You need to warp them accordingly. You will have motion blur because these cameras are recording at a finite exposure time. You have lots of data. They need to be stored, and then they need to get to the storage hard drive or whatever first. And then when you want to look at the scene, you need to decode your stream quickly and randomly, which is also something that in the beginning I thought we didn't have to worry about because this is so obvious and there are so many experts in this area that this has been solved, and we just buy something off the shelf, right? I mean, that being computer graphics, my students are computer science majors. They don't like to tinker with hardware. They don't like to use soldering iron. They burn themselves. They love to program, but this is something that they are not really into. And so you look what's available on the market, and you find out essentially nothing. I was very sad to hear the news that Nokia discontinued the OZO. I thought that was something really worth pursuing. They will have had their reasons. Google made a fantastic advertisement with their camera, but you cannot buy it. You have to build it yourself. They just give you the blueprint. And what they don't tell you, and what we couldn't figure out, we asked the GoPro how to synchronize these cameras. If you know, please let me know, because we haven't figured out still. Then Facebook has this ball, which you cannot buy. This is something I found on the internet. The eye, which looks great. It's just that it's custom made. You have to call them up, and they give you a price, maybe starting at 13,000 and going up to 50,000 or something. The only thing that I found that you can buy is this camera by Samsung. They are actually giving a price on their webpage, which is $10,000 or $10,500, and I think they're selling it in the US. So if I were to import it to Europe, then I would have to pay duty, and so that's even more expensive probably. So right now that's the one that I found. Maybe there are others out there. But still, if you want to have high quality panorama video recording heads, it's expensive and it's not easy to come by. So what everybody's doing that I know is they're building their own thing, and that's what we did. Thank you, 3D printing. We also used the GoPro cameras, 9 of them, and unfortunately we couldn't figure out how to synchronize them correctly, so they're starting whenever they want to start, and then we make sure that we find how they are related, but it's not always on the same time. However, input resolution is pretty good, and that means output resolution is also decent. Ideally, we would like to have this double. We would like to have 22K, 360 round, but for the time being, this is what we could afford, because we don't only need one of them. We need 3 of these heads. I said in the beginning that I think what is very important in this about immersive reality is that you are able to move your head at least a little bit around it and have the impression that you have ego motion parallax. So with a single camera head, you cannot really get that. Maybe with the Samsung thing, I haven't looked at that yet. But our idea was to use 3 of these panorama camera heads and just assemble them in a triangle. So you see here the 3 recordings of the 3 cameras. And you see always the other 2 cameras in the one camera's view. I think you get a feel for what this looks like. And then, given these 3 panorama videos, we want to be able to render any viewpoint that is positioned in between these 3 camera heads. So you are able to move within this triangle, and maybe a little bit extrapolate if you go outside, but not too much. And then by defining or deciding on the baseline, how closely are you spacing these camera heads, you're more or less deciding on the field in which you can move your head, or maybe even your body. Of course, if the cameras are far apart, that then increases the challenge that comes next, which is how to interpolate between these 3 camera positions, of course. But so this was our idea, and we get rid of these images of the cameras by just filling that in from the other cameras. So that is okay. One thing we had to think about was that these camera heads are, of course, not aligned perfectly, right? You just put them on the tripod, and then you make sure that they are more or less level, but of course they're not pixel exact level. So you end up with recordings that look like this. These are 2 of the 3 cameras, and you see this is an atrium, and you see that the floor is kind of wavy. So you want to correct for that, make sure that everything is here in a line, and then what you do is you rotate the whole thing so that if you look at infinity, the same point here shows up at the same X position. Okay, nothing big, it just needs to be done. And it's something that is costing time, because what we want to do is now we want to use these sequences, and we want to render new views. So let's say you have your 3 camera positions here in blue, green, and red, and for any position within between, you want to create the interpolated image. We are not there yet. We are working on it. And the idea that we want to pursue is something from image-based rendering. This is all image-based rendering, of course, because we only have images. And the idea is to use depth and correspondences together. So if you have, and this is from just conventional cameras that are recording an object from different viewpoints, but with the panoramas, it's essentially the same thing. It's just 360 and the geometry is a little bit more complicated. We have the depth and then we have the correspondences, and we use both to then create plausible in-between images. So we get around popping if you're recording at different moments in time and something is moving, or blurring. First of all, yes, we have to come up with the correspondences. We have to come up with depth. So this is computer vision. And computer vision is great for a lot of things. It's not so great, I find, if you use their algorithms for rendering things again. Because in computer graphics, only a few pixels will destroy the impression that the scene is moving naturalistically. Even if they have only a few outliers, the rendered image with that wrong depth at those few points looks horrible. So we have to come up with our own, or at least altered algorithms based on what computer vision has been doing, but then make sure that we either don't get outliers, which is almost impossible, or how to deal with outliers. Detect them, mask them. And you see here a couple of examples using this algorithm where we use depth estimation and correspondence estimation in unison. Let me just... so what you can do now with the... so what we had here was just 70 cameras around this statue. So this is the lion, the Braunschweig lion. Henry the lion, sometimes in the 1200s, I think, was a famous duke of the town. He founded Munich, by the way. And so at that time, Braunschweig was like a major capital in Germany. Has changed since then. But you can now use different arrangements of cameras and get something out of it for the interpolation. Here, this is from a paper by another group, and they provided us with their footage, and we could just do our algorithm on the data. It's not perfect. You still see some small mistakes, but it's better than what has been there before. And so here's another example, just with the smartphone cameras recordings. So having both available, correspondence and depth, helps because you can make sure that outliers in one or the other can get masked and can get corrected. Okay, so the next step for us will be to now look at these algorithms that we developed for this scenario where the cameras are looking in, which is the standard image-based rendering scenario. You have a stage and you have several cameras looking there from different directions. Now we have 3 camera heads looking outward, and for objects that are now approaching, for example, these 3 cameras, we need to be able to render also in between these camera positions. Outliers are still a big issue, of course. Areas that are not seen in any of the 3 cameras are difficult, of course. So you need to come up with something that is not visually salient, but has to be masked in one way or another. You have holes in there. You have these 3 video streams that you have to handle. You have to access the data quickly, and then, of course, render quickly from that. So the rendering algorithm cannot be too complicated either, because you want to be able to react to when someone is moving the user is moving his head. The rendering algorithm has to create the new view within, say, no more than 30 milliseconds. Less than that, actually. So you need to get the data, the right data. You have to do all the warping and so on. Temporal coherence is another thing, because going from one frame to the next, if the depth and the correspondences, say, are not temporally coherent, and you just do this on a frame-by-frame basis, you will see that as well. You will see jumps, and that's very annoying. With that, I thank you for your attention, and I hope that you will help us work on this and make this big thing a real big thing. Thank you.